Hello everybody. Welcome back for another video. Hope you're all well. Hope you're all doing great. Hope you're all fantastic. And that you're all having a wonderful day. Without any further ado, let's jump right into it. I would say lightly dramatic news. So how do I break this to all of you? We are currently in what can only be described as unprecedented times. The world is changing quite rapidly, and it's kind of weird. I can tell you this way: it's kind of weird to be a part of history. We're seeing the rapid growth of Bitcoin, of blockchain, of cryptocurrencies. Years ago, even before I got into the space, the crypto space, I was doing research for about a good year and a half. The space was very weird to me. I didn't understand it. The idea of digital currencies, I was like, what are you that doesn't know? I use paper and maybe sometimes plastic. Has changed quite a bit. One of the original ideas was for lack of a better term, the going away of fiat currencies. And the way that this was proposed, that fiat currencies would end, would basically be through the very slow but eventual complete degradation of the US dollar. You know, it would corrode, it would erode, it would look gross, and then people would eventually stop using it. This came at a time as on 2012, 13, 14. And I remember being like, okay, well, it's going to take a really long time for it to happen. This was sped up exponentially by 2020 and the events that took place and all the money printing that happened. I just recently saw a video. It had nothing to do with crypto, but it had to do with where we are economically as a society. And they were saying that the problem with so many things that we have right now, they went backwards. And they were talking about the early 1900s, the 1910s, the Great Depression. And they said one of the main catalysts, or the idea as to how to get out of this, was to make sure to put more money in the hands of people, to create more structures for people to have better lives, whatever that might have been literally over 100 years ago. They kept on explaining, and they said that the issue now is sometimes a lot of these things are reproposed, for the world. Let's go back to the economic policies of the 1910s. Let's have taxes be this way. Let's have this be this so-and-so. And they said the problem is that we have, 6 billion other people on the planet now. We have a massive society, and things don't work out the way that they did before. They went back into the 1920s and 30s. This idea of the beginning of Social Security and having a way, when you retire, it sounds dark, but this is the way that the system is made. You retire at 60 something and you have only another 5 years left. So here's some money for you to have a good life while you're here. The problem with that has become, for those of you who don't, and I say it logically as maybe you don't know, I try and keep up with as many things as possible, as many things as I can without overwhelming myself. And I'm really into the idea of future technologies and medicine and yada yada. And even since the last 15, 20 years, technology and medicine have become so good. I told you this years ago. In 2018, they said the idea was, even in 2018, that kids born in 2018 would probably live to see 200 years old. And you hear that number and it sounds ludicrous, but then you have people now who are 111 years old who are running marathons. I mean, they're not getting first place, but this was inconceivable in the 1910s. It's estimated that now people around right now in the next 15 to 20 years will experience different forms of science and medicine that will continuously prolong life for 15 years, 15 years, 15 years, 15 years. The issue then becomes the social security system and the retirement system. The way that it works is that younger people work, and then at some point people retire. The younger people pay into the system, and it's older people who have retired who skim some off the top, and this is how they, survive or live throughout the rest of their golden years. But then their golden years become platinum, and then the platinum years become palladium, and then it kind of continues on because once again the old system doesn't really work. By the time the person was talking about the 1940s and 1950s, the idea was that after WW2, people came back and they said, okay, let's change this idea of housing and how people can, be a part of society when it comes to wealth. Because before that, the people who basically ran the world were kings and queens, were the Rockefellers and these other incredibly wealthy families. But how do you get people onto what we now call the property ladder? Is you give them rebates and things like that to start, to be able to get mortgages. So here's where it gets a little funky. Because they said the original idea of mortgages, we've had the idea of debt and mortgages for as long as, time. But in a more structured manner, they said around the 40s and 50s, they began to offer people mortgages, and these were only 5 to 10 year mortgages maximum. It's not because wages were so great or because houses were so cheap. The idea was that someone wouldn't have to take out debt for that long to be able to afford a home or to afford the life that they needed. The issue was that by the early 50s, there were actually a lot of foreclosures that were happening, or what we now would call foreclosures, because these people couldn't continue the payments, especially after having like a basic job, their partner wasn't working, and they had 2 kids. This was restructured in the 60s and 70s to basically become kind of the system that we know now. It started out actually quite nice. The idea was, if people can't do it in 5 to 10 years, realistically, let's give them 15 to 20 years. 15 to 20 seems like a respectable amount of time. Home prices were maybe $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, $10,000 for a decent sized home, or what we would call a decent sized home now. You have 20 years to pay this off, and it actually worked. The problem is that the system becomes way too greedy. This brings us into the 1970s and the advent of I want more. If you ever, I don't know how you would even find an expose or something about it. That movie, Wall Street, where the guy's like, for the lack of a better term, greed is good. A lot of people don't understand that this movie was made in response to the way that the world was developing. People think it was simply like they just happened to make a movie about how the world became greedier. No, it was actually because this is the way that the world began to develop. In the 1970s, once the US and many other countries began to abandon the gold standard and printing more money began, the idea was that, well, we as a bank and we as a country and we as a system, we've seen that the money continues to flow if we give someone a 5, 10, 15% interest rate, which isn't that bad if you have to pay a little bit of money every single month over the course of 20 years. But how do we continue that? How do we make sure that we as the bank continue to make money forever? We give longer mortgages over the course of a 20 to 30 year period. You start to offer mortgages and give out debt in the form of fluctuating interest rates. So it's no longer a 5% interest rate over the course of a 20-year period. It's 7 for the first 10 years, and then it might potentially be 15. And sometimes it's at the whim and the behest of the actual bank. Have any of you must have. I'm sure maybe the majority of you haven't. They're called payday loans. Payday loans began to pick up around the early 2010s, where basically in the US and in the UK where they really became popular. A lot of other countries actually outlawed them because of how predatory isn't even the word. Because of how monstrous that they are. Basically, let's say you are in a tough economic position. You don't have the money. You can't pay your rent. You don't know where this money is going to come from. You need to buy groceries. You can't go to a friend. You can't go to anyone else. No one else has the money. You can't go to a bank. These things called payday loans, they're like literal like shops that you can enter. You can walk inside of and you say, can I get a loan for $200, for 200 pounds? Because I need to do X, Y, and Z. And they go, sure. Of course, why not? And they hand you a stack of paper that they know that you're not going to read through. They tell you to sign and they hand you the money on the spot. The issue is that a lot of these things, you know how like normally you'll have an interest rate of 2%, 3%, 7%. Some credit cards have an interest rate of like 20%, which is like not even red flag. It's like just cut that card up. Payday loans, sometimes payday loans have an interest rate of several 100%, 200, 400. This isn't a joke. You can like Google it. You can if you get a chance, watch documentaries on it on YouTube. Like type in payday loan documentary. You are going to be flabbergasted. And the issue is that, you know, come next payday, it's a payday loan. You're supposed to pay it back on your next payday. You don't have that money with that interest rate. So a lot of people have been known to take out $150, $350 to pay a bill, to keep the lights on, to buy some groceries. And by the end of the year, they owe around several $1,000s. If they couldn't pay back $150, they sure as heck can't pay back that several thousand. After a couple of years, it ends up being $118,000. So this is the system that we currently have. And I'm missing a huge chunk of the history there as well, but for the sake of, you know, what have you. The problem is that this is the only way that the system works. The person then began to talk about the idea of what happened around 2004 to 2009. They said it was apparently obvious around 2004, 2005 that there was like a bubble growing in the housing market. And a lot of analysts began to stand up and say something is wrong. The problem is if you buy a house on a loan for $150K and within a year and a half, it's double the price and someone screams that, you know, the sky is falling, you're not going to listen to them. I just made double my money. What are you talking about? The idea of you trying to sell that home in a couple of years and you can't, and you have to sell it even lower than you first got it for, was not something in the minds of a lot of people. And this is usually indicative of a gigantic bubble. So they said by the time we got to 2006, 2007, it was actually in the newspapers. People were like, this is a bubble. Like something's wrong. We can't sustain this forever. A lot of people are taking out insurmountable. This is back in 2007. Insurmountable levels of debt that they won't be able to pay back. A lot of these mortgages are made up of garbage. They're being given to people with 0% down. It's not sustainable. Something's going to collapse. And then everything does collapse. The issue after that was, instead of printing money like the government did, like you can find old documentaries from the people who are actually at the head of the Fed and the head of like other governmental things, and they said they had discussions every single day. What should we do? And the only conclusion that they came to was we need to print money to push into the markets to keep everything afloat. There were proposals to print money and put it in the hands of people. The people who had lost their homes, who were on the verge of losing their homes, but the decision was made, they're not important enough. We need to keep up the system that we've had that's worked, and I air quote there, worked for the last 100 years so that we can have another 100 years with this system. So money was printed and it was given to the banks and to the institutions because here's the crazy part, because they were seen as the saviors. Why were they seen as the saviors? People saw them, or rather the people in control saw that you helped me make money and the system make money for the last 50 years since the 1980s. This one time you messed up, you probably won't mess up ever again. Here's a bunch of money, fix what you did, don't do it again. People got upset, people got angry, but eventually people forget, housing prices go back up, people start hiring again, people start making money, yada, yada, yada. The levels of debt that we see right now are, the word's not unsustainable. I don't think there's a word in English for it. because we've basically, I know people who have over 10 to 12 credit cards. The excessive levels of debt, of personal debt, of student loan debt, of housing debt, and of country debt. Even just when we have these conversations, we tend to mainly focus on the US. This is happening everywhere around the world. But the big, gigantic elephant in the room with the dollar sign on it is, if the world reserve currency collapses, everything else collapses right along with it. This is the interesting part that we see with cryptocurrencies and with Bitcoin. We see people fleeing the dollar, seeing what's happening, these levels of inflation, and moving their money into the cryptocurrency digital space. It is extremely rare. It is extremely rare for someone in power, for someone who has the power, to actively stand up and say, we have a problem. We need to fix something, but we're unable to fix something. This is one of the things, and I've not joked about it over the years, about the U.S. economic policies and for other countries as well. We see that inflation is bad. It's bad everywhere, some places far more than others. The issue is that this could all be stopped today, right now, if governments around the world said, we are not going to print any more money for the next year. We are going to allocate money that we have for A, B, and C, and we're going to move it into the hands of the consumer, into the hands of the people. We will make sure that you stay afloat as opposed to the corrupt bank staying afloat. But you can't do that because the system is so corroded at this point that you need to continue printing money to keep it going. You need to continue issuing debt to people, and you've seen the uptick in personal debt in the last couple of years. Do you know why that happened? If the banks aren't getting enough money from people buying houses because the housing market slowed a bit in 2020, the idea is we make our money from other people being in debt. Every single month they pay us little droplets, but eventually it fills up the bucket until we have to get another new bucket. If people aren't buying, if people aren't doing all of these things, what do? You introduce this pay now, buy now, pay later thing that you're seeing everywhere online. It's not like a little company who made these things. These are also backed by banks and institutions as well, who are looking for extra ways to get their money. You up the amount of advertisements that people see outside, telling them to go buy, telling them, I know you're unhappy because of the last couple of years. You know what's going to make you happy? Buying this stuff. You make sure that you get them back into debt. You try your best to do everything that you can. I was just watching something. They were discussing, I forgot what school it is in the States. It's now $60,000 a year to attend for 1 year. I forgot what school it was. 60,000, 60000. And they were asking one of the heads of the university. They said, why? Why did you raise your tuition over the course of the last 4 years? You have heavily outpaced inflation. Who can pay this? And the person said, well, we do it because of our level of education. Of course, she was, excuse my French, she was B and S-ing her entire way through. But it's just about greed, because for those of you who don't also know, a lot of banks also own these universities as well. You keep finding ways to be able to skim more off the top. You buy all the houses, you buy all the homes, and you can jack up the rent as much as you want to make the difference in the debt that you were receiving before. It's no longer immediate debt. It's now, well, you got to pay your rent kind of debt. This is the only way that the system works. This is, and I say this lightly, this is the entire idea behind Bitcoin. I wish more people read up and looked about it, but I think maybe even the masses wouldn't understand what they're actually reading. A lot of people go through life simply like floating by all of this grossness, and they don't really take into account where things are, where they were 10 years ago and 10 years before that and 10 years before that. You don't see anything getting better. It just kind of continues to corrode. That's why this news is actually quite interesting because, like I said, it is very rare that we hear someone at the top waving the red flag, being like, this, we have a literal problem. You know him. He's the head of the Fed. His name is Jerome Powell. He said that the U.S. is on an unsustainable fiscal path and that it should be a top-level issue. The problem is that the U.S. needs to print more money. The U.S. prints more money typically to show that the country has grown, that the GDP has grown, that the amount of imports and exports is just as good as last year, if not better, usually 1 to 2 to 3% to show proper growth. You need to print money to pay off your debts. The U.S. is taking out an unprecedented amount of debt to be able to keep the entire market afloat. The only way that you continue to keep the market afloat is by printing more money. When you print more money, you raise the rate of inflation. When you raise the rate of inflation, you devalue the previous currency that you made just a couple of days ago, so then you have to end up printing more. You put your citizens in a precarious situation because they already don't have the money to be able to do the normal things that they were doing before. So what do? You have to print more money to try and devalue your dollar to make sure that other companies and other countries continue to do business within your borders. As you do that, you inflate your dollar even more, and you continue this loop, and it is now unending. This guy is the head of the people who print the US dollar. In a new discussion at the ECB Forum on Central Banking in Sintra, Portugal, Powell said that the U.S. is running a very large deficit that needs to be addressed, ideally sooner rather than later. While he won't comment on any administration-specific policies, Powell says the U.S. needs to return to sustainable financial footing. The International Monetary Fund and the Bank of International Settlements recently said the exact same thing. They said the U.S. is so imbalanced that it's literally teetering. If one side is slightly imbalanced, the entire thing is going to crumble. The entire thing. 2007, 8, and 9 were never fixed. For those of you who did not know. You know what changed? It was simply the amount of money that was printed. It was a gigantic Band-Aid that was put on that's now falling off. It has no grip. They did nothing to fix the system. They had the opportunity to change the entire system, and they didn't. And now we're seeing the repercussions of what they did not do. He said, and I quote, "I'm going to give you the traditional answer to some extent. That is we just don't. Fiscal policy is a job for elected people. We're not elected people, so we don't comment on it, particularly in advance of an election. We're not commenting on anyone's particular policies one way or another." I don't even know what I think I'm going to skip over that part just because I've seen in my life continuously every 4 years, as long as I've been here, people tend to think that the next person in line is going to change things, and nothing ever actually changes. This is usually the trap that most people get into because they think that things are going to be not the word better, but they tend to stay the same for the people who are already in power. He said, "I will say more broadly, though, that the United States is running a very large deficit at a time when we're at full employment and the level of debt is not unsustainable, but the path that we're on is unsustainable." That's completely non-controversial. I would have thought that this is something that should be a top-level issue, and you do hear this from a lot of elected officials, but it should be a real focus going forward. How do we get back to a sustainable path? Because you can't run these kind of deficits in good economic times for very long. I mean, I can't really speak to the time, but in the long run, we'll have to do something sooner or later, and sooner will be better than later. The U.S. currently has trillions of dollars worth of debt that are probably never going to be paid back. When I said we're witnessing history, it's because we're at a gigantic crossroads. I remain a huge advocate for crypto, and I dare even say for Bitcoin. And I spoke to someone before, and we were going over economic policies, and not that we're geniuses on the matter, but we were talking about these things that are going on, and money printing and levels of debt. And we talked about the idea of Bitcoin being like something that sits in the middle that could or would be able to help. We've gotten to the point where economic policies are so shaky and so fragile that a coin, a protocol that was created 15 years ago by a person or group of people, seems like the only escape from the currency. Like, think of how crazy that is. Imagine I created something right now, and in 2039, people were discussing that thing that TMI created seems like the only choice that we have to get out of the current situation that we're in. It's a really perplexing thing to think about. The problem is that this isn't fixable because the people in power refuse to let the old system disappear. Remember all the conversations we've been having about the other countries, the other ones recently who've been banning Bitcoin, who have no regulatory policies or anything like that in place? It has to do with the fact that we've seen on this channel, we've seen in the news, we've seen around the world that there are a plethora, a superabundance of people around the planet who are getting into Bitcoin because, think about this, their local currencies are inflating or collapsing so much in value that they've had to literally go, Bitcoin is more stable than that. Think of how crazy, Bitcoin's not stable. Think of how insane that is. We see this huge amount of money running into the Bitcoin market. And it's become apparent to me, at least, where a lot of this is going, or exactly where the world's going to be in a relatively short period of time. A lot of the predictions that I saw before I got into the market were that the US dollar would slowly lose its power. And this is what we're seeing. 2007 to now, it's been losing it since the 70s, but it's more noticeable as it's more in the news. At some point, the US dollar, will continue to exist. It will continue to exist in some capacity or another, but it won't have any power anymore. It'll simply exist as a symbol of this is the money that we're using. Even the other countries right now, they're not fixing their economic policies, but they're just either printing more money, trying to raise or lower interest rates, or they're trying to create an extra digitized version of the money that they already have. There's no discussion anywhere of changing the way that economics works, of making sure that you don't get people into debt. There's no discussions of all these countries being like, let's wipe out all of our debt and start from zero. But that's, if you understood how everything is interwoven, it's literally impossible. There are families, dynasties that still exist who have made their money and make their riches off of debt. If you collapse them, the whole system collapses. So then you ask yourself, what's the answer? There is no answer to all of this. It's something that we see heading towards us that no one wants to admit, that no one wants to deal with. That's what he was saying. We usually tend to see elected officials talking about this. But still, no one's talking about it because no one wants to talk about it. Because whoever does sit in the seat of power knows that they can't change it. Do you understand that? Do you understand that concept? A lot of people don't understand what it means to be a president or a prime minister or anything of that level. You can say things, but you can't change things. If you change things, you break the system, and you break the system for them as well. We're like, the next 5 years, I think, are going to kind of solidify what kind of direction we go into. Keep in mind, this entire Bitcoin thing is a gigantic experiment. It's an experiment that's working, but I think we're on the cusp of like absolute insanity. This video isn't meant to scare you in any sort of way. I'm just, delivering what's literally happening. You know how we got all those Bitcoin price predictions for 2028, 2029, and 2030? For those of you who haven't seen them, they're all over $1 million. That's why I think the timing of BlackRock and all these other companies getting into the space isn't random. Isn't like, okay, let's get into Bitcoin now. It's excessively planned to a certain degree. I think they know what's happening. If we know what's happening, they know the numbers and they see the actual rapid decline of the old system. As I've said before as well, last thought, if we end up getting to a space in 4.5 years where Bitcoin is over $1 million, he who holds the Bitcoin literally has the power. And this power will only increase as Bitcoin's value against the US dollar continues to rise. Do you understand that there are people who have tens of thousands of Bitcoin? These people are going to be the new powers of the world. The other part of that for me constantly is, what happens to the people who don't have any crypto at all? I told you in another video, the world we're moving into, if we go down the path of hyper Bitcoinization and all these other things like that, the world is becoming, the word's not digitized, more automated. I just watched the video where this guy was saying that by 2040, industry leaders are expecting nearly everything that can be automated to be automated. That goes for what doctors do, the whole slew of what they do. That goes for what nurses do. I don't know if you've seen the videos out of China and out of Japan where they have the robots. That goes for chefs and cooking, art to a certain extent, creating buildings. They said everything will be automated. So a lot of people say, times may be rough, but in the future, people will still have jobs. No, we are entering a new stage of humanity, and it's one with a lot of pain attached to it as we, get dragged through all of this mess that none of it is our fault. But it's very fascinating to see. Well, imagine living in a world where everything is automated, where AI is nearly incorporated into everything. You have a self-driving car, you have a self-sustaining home, you have drones and robots delivering everything. And Bitcoin is worth $23 million a coin. What happens to everyone else? Yeah, that's why I don't fret or get sad when we hear that countries or whoever is selling off their Bitcoin. Because I want those coins to re-enter the market so that everyone can have at least 1 million Satoshis. I don't know how to, what's the word? I don't know how to explain it, but I can see it all in front of me. Like I can literally see it all happening. And when you hear that the guy who's printing the US dollar is literally like, we have a really big problem on our hands. Because no matter who takes over, whoever takes over the Fed next, they can't change the course of this road that we're on, because we would go into something even worse than a depression. You can't stop the system. It has to stop itself. But even then, when it breaks apart, like this is completely nuts what we're witnessing. A lot of other countries recently have been in discussions to lower their interest rates. The idea being that they make getting into debt once again more attractive. You want the general public to see that interest rates have dropped so that they will buy homes and that they'll get into debt and then they'll get mortgages so that the drip continues once again. As of now, recently, we heard that apparently, allegedly, who knows, that in September, we might see an actual rate cut, simply because of this discussion that Jerome Powell had, but also other minutes that he's had recently where he was like, we've gotten to the point where we might have to do something. But the problem is, as he discussed, he said if we do something, it's going to cause inflation to spike. And then it took them 2 years and some change to get it under control to where it currently is right now. If you have multiple different interest rate cuts, inflation's going to go up. The people who hold the assets will benefit, and everyone else will not benefit. And this will continue until they stop cutting interest rates. But at that point, you've also raised the debt levels to such another unsustainable level. Where are we in 5 years? Where's the world in 8 years? We get a lot of discussions about Bitcoin's price in 2034 and stuff like that, but what's happened to the rest of the world financially? It's a very deep conversation that I think a lot of people, especially in crypto, don't want to have. Yeah, we are witnessing and living through history, and I mean a multitude of different ways. Yeah. I was gonna say I hope you all enjoyed, but I think it's one of those videos where it's like I can feel the cloud in the sky after this conversation. I hope you somehow managed to have a great day. I hope you managed to have a wonderful morning, afternoon, and evening, wherever you are, wherever you might be. I do hope it's absolutely fantastic. Thank you all once. Sorry, I was looking at my leg and then I was like, I'm not speaking English. Thank you all once again for watching, listening, liking, commenting, and supporting. And I will most certainly be talking to you all soon. See you.